I am sitting on a hard plastic chair, surrounded by 2,000 people. The air is thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the sound of a brass band playing upbeat graduation music. Everyone around me is cheering. Parents are waving, students are throwing their caps in the air, and the sun is beating down on the stadium. I should be the happiest person in the room. I am wearing a black gown, a heavy velvet hood, and a gold tassel that marks me as the class valedictorian. But my eyes aren't on the stage. My eyes are fixed on row 4, seat 12. It's just a simple wooden chair, tucked between a woman in a bright floral dress and a man with a large professional camera. And it is completely empty. My name is Claudia. To anyone looking at me today, I am a picture of success. I am a first-generation college graduate with a degree in civil engineering. People see a confident young woman ready to build the world. But if they looked closer, they would see a girl whose heart is breaking for the man who was supposed to be in that seat. My father, Thomas, was a man of steel and silence. He didn't have a college degree, and he didn't work in a fancy office. He spent 30 years of his life hanging from iron beams hundreds of feet in the air. He was a construction worker, an ironworker. When I was a little girl, I used to look up at the city skyline and imagine my father was a giant. He would leave the house at 4:30 a.m., long before the sun even thought about rising. I remember the sound of his heavy work boots hitting the floorboards, thud, thud, thud. Those boots were thick, brown, and always covered in dried mud and concrete dust. He used to tell me, "Claudia, I stand on the edge of the sky so you can have a solid floor under your feet." I didn't really understand what that meant back then. I just knew that when he came home, his face was often red from the sun or blue from the freezing wind. His hands were thick and calloused, with skin as rough as sandpaper. He would sit at the kitchen table, too tired to even take off his safety vest, and ask me about my school day. We lived in a tiny apartment where the walls were thin and the neighborhood was loud. But my father made sure my desk was always in the quietest corner. He bought me the best pens and the thickest notebooks, even if it meant he had to skip lunch for a week. He treated my education like it was a skyscraper he was building, one floor at a time, with no room for mistakes. As I stare at that empty seat today, the music feels distant. I realize that every brick in my life was laid by his tired hands. But the man who built the view for me is no longer here to see it. The graduation ceremony continues. The dean is talking about the leaders of tomorrow and the bright road ahead. But my mind is drifting back to 4 years ago, during my freshman year of college. That was the winter the world felt like it was made of ice. I remember coming home for the winter break. The apartment was freezing because the old radiator had finally given up. My father, Thomas, was sitting at the small kitchen table, rubbing his knees. He was 55, but in the harsh morning light, he looked 70. His joints made a clicking sound every time he moved. Ironworking is a young man's game, but Thomas refused to quit. "Dad, your boots," I said that morning, pointing at the floor. His brown work boots were literally falling apart. The leather was cracked, and the thick rubber soles were held together by industrial duct tape. "You need new ones. You're working on the 40th floor. If you slip..." He just waved his hand, dismissing my fear. "They have a few more miles in them, Claudia. Besides, your tuition for next semester is due on Monday. Engineering books aren't cheap." I felt a lump in my throat. I told him I could take a part-time job at the library, or maybe skip the spring semester to work and help him. He looked at me then, really looked at me, with eyes that were as gray and steady as the steel beams he climbed. "No," he said. It was the loudest he ever spoke. "You don't stop. You don't look down. You just keep climbing. I didn't spend 30 years in the sky so my daughter could spend her life in a library basement. You finish what you started." That winter, he took every overtime shift available. While other people were inside, drinking hot cocoa by a fireplace, my father was hundreds of feet in the air. He was walking on narrow beams slick with frost, the wind whipping against his face like a knife. He did it for 40 extra hours a week. He did it so I could have the software I needed for my design classes. He did it so I never had to worry about a roof over my head. I remember one Friday night. He came home so exhausted he fell asleep in his chair before he could even take off his safety harness. I sat on the floor and quietly untied his boots. When I pulled them off, I saw that his socks were damp with melted snow. His feet were bruised and swollen. I cried quietly that night, holding those heavy, muddy boots. I realized then that my degree wasn't going to be made of paper. It was being forged out of his sweat, his pain, and his absolute refusal to let me fail. Back in the stadium, the first row of students starts to stand up. The line is moving toward the stage. My heart is beating fast. I look at seat 12 again. I can almost see him there, wearing his one good suit, the one he bought years ago for my mother's funeral. I can almost hear him telling me to keep climbing. But then, the memory of that phone call from 3 weeks ago hits me, and the stadium lights feel a little too bright. 3 weeks ago, that phone call changed everything. I was sitting in the quiet section of the university library, working on my final structural design project. My phone buzzed on the wooden table. It was an unknown number with a city area code I recognized. My stomach dropped. "Is this Claudia Miller?" a man's voice asked. He sounded out of breath. "Your father, he's been taken to the hospital. He didn't fall, but he collapsed on the job site. We're at St. Jude's Medical Center." I don't remember the drive. Everything was a blur of highway lights and tears. When I finally reached the hospital, I found him in a small, cold room filled with the sound of beeping machines. Without his orange safety vest and his heavy boots, he looked so small. He looked like an old tree that had finally been pushed over by the wind. The doctor pulled me aside. He told me that my father's heart was simply exhausted. Years of working in the heat and the freezing cold, combined with a condition he had never mentioned to me, had finally caught up. He had been hiding his pain for months, maybe years. He didn't want to see a doctor because he didn't want to miss a single day of work. He didn't want to risk me losing my final semester. He had sacrificed his health to pay for my future. When he finally opened his eyes, he didn't ask for water. He didn't ask for medicine. He looked at my hands. "Did you finish the project?" he whispered. His voice was so weak, like a fading radio signal. "Yes, Dad. It's done. Graduation is in 2 weeks. You have to get better. You have to be there." He gave me a tired, shaky smile. He touched my sweater sleeve with a hand that had once lifted tons of steel. "I'll be there, Claudia. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Row 4. Right. We had talked about that seat for months. He was so proud of it. He told every nurse and every janitor who walked into that room. "My daughter is going to be an engineer," he would say, even when he could barely breathe. But as the days passed, the beeps on the monitor grew slower. The strength that had held up skyscrapers was gone. 3 days before my graduation, in the quiet hours of the early morning, he took his last breath. He died knowing I had finished, but he never got to see me in that black gown. And now, as the announcer begins to read the names, the wind feels colder. Row 4, seat 12 is empty, and I feel like I'm standing on a bridge with no supports. "Claudia Miller." The voice booms over the stadium speakers. My heart stops. This is the moment we worked for. I stand up, my legs feeling like lead. As I walk toward the stage, I don't look at the cameras. I don't look at the professors. I look at row 4, seat 12. It is still empty, but for a split second, I swear I can see a shimmer in the air. A shadow of a man in a dusty orange safety vest, leaning forward, waiting for me to take that final step. I reach the top of the stairs. The dean hands me a leather folder. "Congratulations, Claudia. Your father would be so proud," he whispers. He knew my father. He knew about the struggle. I take the diploma, but I don't feel like a winner. I feel like a survivor. After the ceremony, I don't go to a fancy dinner. I don't go to a party. I drive my old car to the construction site where he worked. It is quiet because it is a Sunday. I stand at the base of the massive steel skeleton he helped build. The wind whistles through the iron beams, sounding like a low, familiar hum. I find his locker in the temporary trailer. The supervisor had told me to come collect his remaining things. My hands are shaking as I turn the key. Inside, there are no tools. Those had already been packed away. There is only a small, wrapped box and a note written on a piece of scrap construction paper. The handwriting is messy and shaky, written by a man who spent his life holding heavy metal, not pens. Claudia, I know I might not make it to that seat. My body is tired, but my heart is full. I bought this with the overtime from the last bridge job. Wear it when you design your first building. I am always looking up at you. Love, Dad. I open the box. Inside is a high-end professional laser measuring tool, the kind top architects and engineers use. It is expensive. It is perfect. It is the last thing his tired, calloused hands ever bought for me. I am sitting on the edge of a steel beam now, looking out over the city skyline. I realize that I am his greatest project. Every hour he spent in the freezing cold, every bruised finger, and every drop of sweat was a brick in the foundation of my life. He didn't just build skyscrapers. He built a future. So, if you are reading this and you still have your parents, call them. Don't wait for a graduation. Don't wait for a tragedy. Because some seats remain empty forever, but the love that put you there is eternal. I am an engineer now, and every building I design will be a tribute to the man who stood in the sky so I could reach the stars.